Hey everyone, I recently bought the 9070 XT graphics card and I'm really excited about it because it seems like a really good card. I think AMD have knocked it out of the park. But in this video I wanted to actually do a really detailed video and discuss everything you might need to know about the card, including the fact that right now there is a fairly significant coil whine issue with this particular card. But I think in time, after doing loads of testing, I think this issue will go away. But I wanted to talk about that later in this video. Obviously I'll be doing lots of gaming benchmarks too, but I also wanted to dive into things like the thermals. So I use my thermal camera and a bunch of other stuff to actually show exactly where the hotspots are on the card. And I've also tested with a Noctua air cooler and a Corsair all-in-one liquid cooler, so I can discuss the best cooling methods open to you. I also tested with both a Gen 4 and Gen 5 motherboard, and I also put them in Gen 3 mode as well, so I can give you all the data you need to actually know whether you can, stick with your Gen 4 motherboard or whether upgrade into Gen 5 to make use of the fact that this is a PCI Express Gen 5 card, of course. I'll give you all of that information so you can make that decision. And I also discuss a lot more than that, but there are chapters in this video so you can jump to the bit that actually interests you the most. So this is the Sapphire Pulse, which is Sapphire's entry-level model. You've then got the Pure and the Nitro Plus above it, but actually Sapphire are a very good graphics card manufacturer for AMD. And so the performance you actually get with this Pulse graphics card will actually be comparable to some of the other models. And of course, pretty much everything I talk about in this review is, applicable to the 9070 XT, because that's the actual GPU die or whatever. So it's not that this is a review of just the Sapphire Pulse, but the box itself is all fairly simple and plain. When you open it up, you then got the graphics card in an anti-static bag, of course, and then the accessories box. In there, you've got an anti-sag bracket, which is very important to use. Because this is quite a heavy card, if you don't use any form of anti-sag bracket, then actually the card could droop down, either damaging the card's PCB or the PCI Express slot on your motherboard. So it is worth using this anti-sag bracket. But then, as I said, there's nothing else in the box. You don't need any fancy squid adapter with 12-volt power cables for this particular model, because it just has standard 8-pin power. And I'm not actually a massive fan of how the 8-pin connectors are placed on this particular card, because they recessed in the back, and so often you need to actually run the cables in from the back for the best cable management potential. You don't have anything like the Nitro Plus that has that fancy backplate to actually hide the 12-volt power cable you run in. So that's one particular thing I didn't love, but it's not a massive thing really in the grand scheme of things. And actually, as I said, the card in general is brilliant. I'll go on to the benchmarks in a minute. But the actual 9070 XT is part of AMD's new RDNA 4 architecture, which is a brand new architecture, and it also brings with it FSR4 upscaling, which I'll talk about later in this video. But without further ado, I wanted to jump into the gaming benchmark. And you can see the specs that I'm using to test this card on the screen now. And in fact, I changed my motherboard as part of this. So originally I had a B650 motherboard with a Gen 4 PCI Express slot, upgraded that to a like-for-like X870 motherboard, also from ASRock and the Pro RS line, but that gives me the PCI Express Gen 5 slot. And then later on, as I said, I'll do those comparisons to actually show whether you need to upgrade or not. But let's just get on with the gaming benchmarks. And I wanted to start out with Cyberpunk, because that's always a great game to try things out on. Really good looking game still, and in native 4K, so no upscaling or anything like that. I got the high preset but no ray tracing for this particular example, and actually it looks and feels really good. Not my gameplay necessarily, but the actual game itself. And you can see there it's around 70 FPS. The graphics card's using 300 watts. Good stable 1% lows, and the GPU is being worked much harder than the CPU. So only got a mid-range, Ryzen 7600 CPU, but in this case, especially at 4K, the graphics card is the bottleneck, and yeah, really good showing here. But what happens if we try and turn on FSR, so the upscaling? Will that lead to better results? Well, we were seeing 70 FPS. With this on, we're now seeing around 120 FPS, so almost doubling, or so it would seem, but I did put frame gen on as well. But unfortunately, the game looks pretty bad. I mean, I'm not sure if it comes through because of YouTube's compression, but actually the game looks and feels absolutely terrible with FSR 3, unfortunately. But what about if we do Ray Tracing Ultra? Will that make things better? Well, what I've done here is actually put things at 50% speed, and everything just looks bad again. The steps look awful, the windows don't really look like windows. Everything's just a little bit blurry, like almost some sort of dream world really, and you can see the ray tracing looks quite good there, but everything is pretty bad, to be honest, and this is due to FSR 3, unfortunately. And this isn't me hating on AMD or FSR3. Well, I am hating on FSR3. It's quite bad, actually, as Hardware Unboxed and other people have shown. But I'm not trying to hate on AMD, really. It's just that Cyberpunk's implementation of FSR3 is really, really bad. So it is worth knowing that. And luckily, you know, these cards do support FSR4. But right now, Cyberpunk doesn't support that unless you want to try out, you know, unofficial mods and things like that. So right now, your options really are to try and use FSR3 or Intel XeSS for that matter on Cyberpunk, or go with native rendering. So what I'm going to try doing is go into ray tracing low and seeing whether I can run that then natively with no FSR and no frame gen, and seeing if that works. So I restarted the game. So this is 4K native with ray tracing low, so some level of path tracing and ray tracing, and it looks pretty damn good in my opinion. And we are seeing average FPS rates of around 60 FPS, which I think is actually amazing. That's a really, really good result with, you know, this particular AMD graphics card, because previously, you know, you wouldn't have had these sort of numbers. So I'm actually really impressed with this. And the 1% lows as well are pretty good, around 40. Obviously many people wouldn't want a game, you know, with 40 or 50 FPS, but this actually looks and feels fairly stable. I don't get any stutters, and actually I think it looks brilliant. You know, RT low is actually still very, very good in this game. But if you've dialed it down to 1440p, so ray tracing low, a little bit of ray tracing and path tracing on, and then no FSR and no frame gen, you get in 90 FPS. Which is really, really good. I mean, it's a really impressive result. And actually it all looks stunning, and again, this feels really smooth and everything else. So the fact that this card can, you know, get these sort of frame rate levels with 1440p native is actually really, really good in my opinion, especially since the city area tends to stress things out quite a lot. In this final comparison, I wanted to look at the RTX 5080, which I've also got, and compare it to this particular card, because I am hoping to be able to get rid of my RTX 5080, to be honest, based on how good the AMD card is. And if we look at the average FPS rates, you know, it is lower on the AMD card. You're looking at 60 to 70 compared to 80 or 90 on the NVIDIA card, but actually I still think that's pretty damn good. Now obviously the 9070 XT isn't designed to be a competitor to the RTX 5080, but I give that final example just so you can have some context, because I've got both graphics cards, and actually it's quite interesting that really I think there's only like a 20% performance difference without ray tracing, because this was high with ray tracing disabled, and actually I think 20% performance difference is pretty damn good for AMD, because, you know, there's not a 20% price difference between the two cards. Often you can pay almost double for 5080 compared to a 9070 XT. So I think that AMD are offering really good value with this card. But next I wanted to look at Hogwarts Legacy. So I launched the game and waited for shaders to compile, which takes ages, but I did this at 4K with FSR2 enabled, so 1440p internally, and everything maxed out, so ultra graphical settings, ray tracing on, with no frame gen, and actually it looks really good considering it's FSR2, and actually really good FPS rates too, above 130, 140 FPS, and good 1% lows as well. It's 80 odd, 90 odd. And actually, you know, you can see the graphics card using around 300 watts, and it's doing a really good job. So I wanted to see what would happen now if we just did native rendering. Would that change anything? So yeah, same settings, everything maxed out, and again we're seeing, you know, 90 to 100 FPS, which is really good. This is 4K native, so really my GPU is being maxed out, my CPU is not being used all that much, and again it's doing a really good job. Now the graphics card's using almost 14 gigs of VRAM, so I'm really glad that AMD are offering 16 gigs on this particular card. And then if we look at 1440p native and we scale it down, what we actually see is the card, you know, starts not struggling so much, but actually GPU usage is now often below 90%, and actually the CPU becomes a little bit more of a bottleneck, but it's still getting very, very good frame rates, you know, over 100 FPS, and everything looks really, really good here. And actually the board's only now drawing, well, less than 250 watts of power, which is quite interesting, and it's using less VRAM too, but this is a really good experience if you wanted to game at 1440p native. That's very good. So yeah, this card does really well in Hogwarts Legacy, even though it's got, you know, FSR2, that's certainly better than Cyberpunk's FSR3 implementation, but obviously you can play natively at 4K or 1440p with really good frame rates too, so yeah, massive win. Next I wanted to check out Metro Exodus. Moving on. Metro Exodus. So again, 4K native, you know, I've got 4K monitors, so I like gaming at that, and actually, you know, 60 FPS, good 1% lows as well, as you can see there, 12 gigs of VRAM, and the graphics card's using around 300 watts, and in this case, you know, GPU utilization is almost always at 100%, CPU usage mainly below 40%, even though it just went up a bit, but in general, you know, this is a good experience. You know, if you are happy to game at like 60 FPS, it is pretty good, but this is with everything maxed out, ultra settings and ray tracing ultra as well. If we now drop that down to high, and the RT is high as well, immediately the FPS rate goes up. So instead of getting around 60 odd, we get in, you know, 70 to 80, depending on where you are in the game, and the 1% lows are above 60. So another really good experience. Actually, this is a really good solid FPS rate with no frame gen or anything like that, considering it's native 4K rendering. But if we looked at 1440p, and again, we'll stick with high as opposed to ultra, what we see in here is really good frame rate. So 150, 160 plus, 1% low, so often 120 plus as well. The graphics card continues to pull in 300 watts here, and again the GPU is the main thing being used here, although my CPU is being hit, you know, 50-60% CPU usage, so, you know, using something like a 9800X 3D would obviously increase the frame rates even more, but again, you know, you're looking at 150 plus with pretty good graphical image quality, so actually I think this is a really good experience. So I'll go back to gaming stuff in just a minute, but I wanted to talk about thermals, and I did a lot of testing here because people often say that, you know, AMD graphics cards run hotter than Nvidia ones. So I run Furmark loads, I used my thermal camera, I tested with a Noctua air cooler and a Corsair all-in-one liquid cooler, just to give you as much data as possible. And I also monitored the exhaust temps just so we can see how those work. But let's dive into the results. So the first thing I did is run Furmark for 20 minutes because that really stresses out the GPU, and then I just kept an eye on the thermals and everything else. At first I tested with my Noctua air cooler, and you can see there's not much of a gap between the GPU and the air cooler, but that shouldn't affect performance that much. Although you do see the CPU temps are averaging around in the 70s, and actually sometimes they peak at 80, so you're not going to get thermal throttling, but it is decently high. Then if we look at the GPU, we get a GPU temperature of 55, memory temperature of 90, and if you look at the comparison to the 5080, the board temperatures are often 20 degrees lower, which is really good, although obviously, you know, the memory temperature is higher, but that's actually still well within range. But next I wanted to move to an air cooler, just to see whether that would affect things. I didn't think it would affect the GPU temps, but obviously it would have more of an impact on the CPU temps. But that's me just fitting it, and that's the final effect. You know, the radiator at the top in this particular case, just so I still got those case fans at the front, bringing air in. And you can see again, I'm just running the furry donut there to actually stress out my GPU. And if we look at the final temperatures now, you know, it's similar, you know, GPU temperature 50 odd, memory temperature 89, 90, hotspot of 80, so all really good actually, but my CPU temperatures are a lot more under control. And there was nothing wrong with the air cooler temperatures for the CPU. They weren't going to thermal throttle or anything, but obviously the air cooler has kept things under control a lot more. But when it comes to the actual exhaust temperatures, which is ultimately the things that's going to heat up your room and everything else, what I actually did was get a little thermostat that you can see there and put it into the rear exhaust fan. And then I tested with both my Noctua air cooler and obviously the all-in-one cooler as well. And I seen, you know, what was the actual maximum temperature. So even though this is a clamp meter, it can actually detect temperature too. And with the all-in-one cooler, the maximum exhaust temperatures I've seen was 33 degrees Celsius or 91 Fahrenheit. With the air cooler, it was slightly higher. I think things peaked around 35 degrees Celsius or 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So not too much difference, only a couple of degrees really. And next I wanted to get my thermal camera and just check things out there. So with my Noctua air cooler, you can see the actual heat fins of the CPU cooler aren't very hot. They're below 30 degrees Celsius. And it's the graphics card itself, you know, pictured by that little red mark that's actually above 40 degrees Celsius. And if we dive into things a bit more, if you look at my exhaust fans with my Noctua air cooler, I had two there, and it was only the one on the left that was actually getting most of the heat. To be honest, the one on the right wasn't doing that much. If we then go back to looking at the graphics card, the actual backplate was hitting around 50 odd degrees Celsius, so it was fairly hot to touch, but that is normal and in keeping with what we've seen with HW Info. If we then look at the right hand side of things, the actual motherboard itself is below 40 degrees Celsius, and it's mainly the graphics card on the right hand side that is the warmest bit. above 45 degrees Celsius, but again, that is normal. You'd expect that for graphics card when gaming. If I then look up with my all-in-one cooler and I do the same sort of tests, again, the graphics card is going to be the hottest thing. You know, there's not actually that much heat at all on the motherboard or the CPU there, so the pump is doing its job. And because we haven't got that massive air cooler in the way, we can see where the GPU die is more, and actually that's where most of the heat is, 60 to 70 degrees Celsius, that's the main hotspot. And if we actually dive into things from the underside a little bit more, or the side view, you can see it's going up to around 75 to 80 degrees Celsius on the maximum reading, which is in line with what we were seeing with HW Info. And that's obviously because if we look at this static image, that's where the GPU die is. That's where the hotspot was, and that's completely normal. I've pictured the area here. You would fully expect for that area to be the hottest, and that's why you've obviously got that leftmost fan, which is obviously going to be bringing in a bunch of air to actually cool it. And that's why personally I like actually having some intake fans under my graphics card. It's not essential, but obviously by having those intake fans, it's going to bring in more cool air and just help to cool things a bit more. And I wanted to highlight this by playing with fire, literally. So don't try this at home, but I actually bought some smoke matches, and what you can actually see once I've actually lit it is giving off a load of smoke, and you can see the airflow a little bit. So the intake fans are actually bringing some cool air in. The graphics card is then going to use that to cool itself, and also that gets exhausted out to the rear exhaust fan mainly. You can see it there, and then obviously in the leftmost fan, it's actually bringing that into the graphics card, and then that's actually being vented out to the side of the graphics card. Really, the more intake fans you have, the better really, because that's going to help cool a graphics card that pulls in 300 watts, for example. But what is nice about this graphics card design, and it's a fairly conventional one, but that left-hand fan is going to bring in cool air, it's going to cool the GPU die and then exhaust out of this side that you can see on the screen now. And that's quite a nice design, and I think that's why we were seeing the GPU temperatures be in the 50 degrees compared to like the RTX 5080, where obviously things are a lot warmer, going up to like 70 odd degrees on average. So the 9070 XT cooling design is quite nice in my opinion, and again, going back to the point of having as much airflow as possible, you can see how the airflow is actually working for my 3 intake fans. And actually, the bottom one's going to be drawing air into the graphics card, the middle one, well, and the top one really isn't going to be doing all that much for the graphics card, but it's going to help cool the motherboard and the VRM and the CPU if you had an air cooler, but obviously less important if you've got a pump, to be honest. I think the main thing, if you've got an all-in-one cooler, is actually just make sure you've got at least one exhaust fan. But you can see there the airflow, and actually things are looking quite effective, and my system's staying fairly cool, so I'm quite happy with the cooling performance. But next, let's take a look at FSR 4. FSR is AMD's upscaling technology, and I'm not going to talk about exactly what that is in loads of detail, but let's say I'm playing a game at 4K with everything maxed out and, it's really struggling. What you can actually do is turn on upscaling, and internally the game will be rendered at 1440p, for example, and then FSR in this particular case will upscale it back to 4K. But unfortunately, FSR 3 wasn't exactly very good, and that's where FSR 4 comes in with the 9000 series launch from AMD, because AMD really needed to make some graphical gains here with FSR 4, and they have done that from what I can tell, but actually the unfortunate thing is not many games support FSR 4. There's various lists online, and often they have like 20 to 30 games that apparently support FSR 4, but what I actually found in my experience is that some of them actually don't. I actually went through my existing game library and none of those supported FSR 4, so then I downloaded Marvel Rivals because it's free and I'm cheap, and apparently that supports FSR 4, and to be honest, it doesn't seem to support it. Like, I looked as much as I could, I looked in the AMD software, and I went into the game itself, and there's no option to, override to FSR 4 support. And actually, if you look at many of the FSR 4 lists, what they say is current or upcoming games. So I'm assuming that Marvel Rivals is one of those games that supports DLSS 4, Nvidia's latest, but doesn't support AMD's FSR 4, which is a big pity. And during the process of finding this out, I accidentally got sucked into an online game in Marvel Rivals, and I didn't have a clue what I was doing. I was playing with real people and kept cocking up, so sorry if you were playing with me, but yeah, it's actually quite a fun game. I just kept smashing things. I didn't have a clue what I was doing. But after dying one too many times, I got bored and I downloaded Smite 2 instead, and that does have an FSR 4 option within the AMD software. Now, in time, some games will actually be updated to actually have the FSR toggle within the game options itself, within the settings menu, but in most other cases, you're going to use the AMD 4 software and actually override things. So if a game supports FSR 3.1 and then AMD whitelist it, what you can actually do is come along and enable FSR 4 within the AMD software, as you can see here. And And then once you launch the game, it says FSR4 is available, but not necessarily enabled, because you've then got to go into the game and make sure FSR is turned on, so quality or performance or whatever else. And then if you Alt and Z, the overlay will then show that FSR4 is active. And then you can play the game. And actually, yeah, this was a really fun game as well. I just kept spamming things, number keys and everything else, and yeah, good game. But actually this is FSR4, and you know, graphically this isn't the most demanding of games, but FSR4 looked and felt really good. I had no issues or bugs with it. But obviously the game isn't the most graphically challenging, and so when I compared that to FSR3, I couldn't personally notice that much difference, but certainly there was no regressions with FSR4, and obviously my frame rates were quite good too, and actually I had frame gen on, and for this sort of game where it's online and multiplayer and fast action, you know, frame gen can be a bit debatable, but actually I had a good experience with FSR4 and frame gen, so that is pretty good. But what's not good is this segue to our sponsor. Kidding. No, what's not good is the Coil Whine on this particular card, which unfortunately is a real issue. So I put a microphone onto the back of my case, as you can see here, and then I recorded Coil Whine in a range of situations. Some games didn't seem to have any at all, but games like Guardians of the Galaxy had it quite a lot. So you can hear exactly the sound now, and it's not exactly good, to be honest. I did find when playing the game, sometimes the Coil Whine got better, but often, you know, it wasn't great, to be honest. However, the fact that it happens more in menus than when playing the game could mean that actually if you set like an FPS cap, that could actually help to reduce or even eliminate Coil Whine. But this is a result of that. What I wanted to do as well is play around with power limiting within the AMD app to see whether that would reduce Coil Whine too. And I mainly focused on reducing the fan speed just in case, and then obviously the power limit like I mentioned. So I put a minus 10% power limit in the first instance and run the Guardians of the Galaxy benchmark. And I've ramped up the audio a little bit just so you can hear the Coil Whine, hopefully. You might need to be wearing headphones, but certainly at least for me with headphones on, it is quite audible now. But if you notice there, the Coil Whine stopped when it went from one scene to another. Same thing there, the Coil Whine sort of comes and goes, which is a bit weird really, but that can happen with Coil Whine. But next I wanted to actually try out a minus 30% power limit and see whether that would change anything. And I think it reduced it. It certainly reduced it. It's not as audible in my opinion, and now you can probably hear the fans more than the Coil Whine. Whereas with a minus 10% power limit, I think you could hear the Coil Whine more than the fans. So it's still annoying, but it's an improvement, I guess. So that's obviously a very quick test, but I did notice a reduction in the Coil Whine. It wasn't completely eliminated, but by just whacking a 20% or minus 20% power limit on it, I actually seen, you know, not much change in the FPS rate. I think it was 7 FPS drop on average, and it did obviously reduce the Coil Whine too. And my hunch is that Coil Whine is often something you see more with brand new products, and then it gets a bit better over time. So I am hopeful that actually, you know, through playing with power limiting and maybe putting an FPS cap on and just waiting for a few weeks, I'm hoping that the Coil Whine situation will get a little bit better. Next up, I wanted to talk about motherboards, and more specifically PCI Express generations. I ran through quite a lot of tests here, running 3D Mark, Assassin's Creed Mirage, Cyberpunk 2077, Guardians of the Galaxy, and finally Red Dead Redemption 2, and I may as well jump directly into the results. So I tested everything at Gen 4 X16 via my B650 motherboard, and then I went into the BIOS and actually overridden things to Gen 3 and repeated the same tests. Then I tested everything at Gen 5 with my new X870 motherboard, and here are the average FPS scores. There's not much point in me saying much more really, because overall the average FPS rate is very similar. I'll call out a few separate results in a minute, but other than Guardians of the Galaxy, you're not going to see much difference, if any, between, you know, a Gen 3 motherboard and a Gen 5 motherboard, which is good to know. But what about Guardians of the Galaxy? Well, I think this was more of an outlier, because in all my other tests, things were very, very similar. So I don't know why there was such a big difference, but certainly this was one game where, yeah, Gen 5 seemed to do a little bit better. If you've got a Gen 4 motherboard, for example, you don't need to upgrade to Gen 5, unless that Gen 5 board has, you know, other features that you want. But certainly Gen 4 X16 will work perfectly fine, as will, you know, Gen 3 X16 as well. But what doesn't work as well is if you start going down to like X8 or X4 bandwidth levels. So this took quite a long time to test, to be honest, but it was also kind of fun. So what I did in the BIOS was I went in and I actually changed the main X16 slot to like X8 or X4 speeds via the BIOS bifurcation option essentially, and then I rerun all my tests. You know, Assassin's Creed there at Gen 3 X4 and then Gen 3 X8. And I'll dive into the results and then call some specific ones out in a minute, but at X8 bandwidth levels, there's no real difference apart from Guardians of the Galaxy, that always seems to vary, but with everything else it's pretty similar. But when we come to X4, we do start seeing more performance drop-offs. It's hard to show with average FPS, but I'll show more specific results in a minute. But in general, we did start to see a little bit of drop-off with Gen 3 and Gen 4 at X4. And as we can see here, at Gen 3 X4, the GPU is being starved of that bandwidth, and then that is causing the CPU to wait longer, and that's affecting the minimum FPS rates. It's a little bit better with Gen 4 X4, as you can see the minimum FPS rate is higher, but the CPU is still waiting, so this isn't really ideal. So at X4, you're going to have some issues unless you use Gen 5, which had no issues at all. So the Gen 5 X4 results were comparable to the Gen 5 X8 and X16 results. And I kind of feel that that's a lot of data to get through, but that was the purpose of this particular review, is just give you loads of information, but with YouTube chapters, so you can skip to the bits you want, so that, you know, if you're debating whether to go with an air cooler or liquid cooler, you can actually decide that, or if you weren't sure what motherboard to go for, you can decide that too, hopefully with this review. But I think overall it's fair to say that AMD have knocked out the park with this particular graphics card. I'm actually really impressed with what they've done for it. It's a good 4K gaming graphics card, and yes, FSR 3 is rubbish in games like Cyberpunk, but you know, actually you can play natively. That's the brilliant thing with this card, and I'm hoping in time FSR 4 support does get rolled out more, and then I'll come back to that point in future videos. Equally, I'm aware that I haven't really gone into overclocking or undervolting much in this video. I did show undervolting a little bit, where I took 100 watts off things and only had like a 7 average FPS drop in Guardians of the Galaxy, but I mainly didn't cover that because, you know, the average user actually doesn't want to play around with that too much, but I will probably do a separate video on that in the future, and if you want that, please do let me know down in the comments. But if you've got any questions or anything like that, please let me know down in the comments. This video took quite a long time to put together, so if you enjoyed it, please click the thumbs up button and please subscribe to see more videos like this. Thanks for watching.